Welcome to Chapter 1. In this chapter, we are going to discuss what psychology is, the history of psychology, we'll talk about the different perspectives in psychology, and then a little bit about if you wanted to be a psychologist as a career, what are the different options available for you. So let's start by talking about the definition of psychology. And the definition of psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So we all know what behavior is. It's an outward action, something that is observable, something that we can see others doing. But mental processes might seem a little bit more foreign as a concept. So mental processes refers to everything that goes on within the mind. This is such things as memory, perception, consciousness, sleep, dreams, feelings, reasoning, emotions, biological activities, so on and so forth. So in psychology, we attempt to study both the observable and the unobservable, meaning what goes on inside the mind, in a way that is scientific in nature. So we all are kind of mini psychologists. We go through our lives and we wonder why someone does the things that they do, or why they think the way they think, or why they have the emotions that they have. We get cut off on the 10 freeway and we ask ourselves, why did that person do that? And then we hypothesize reasons why they might have done that. Because they're an asshole, because they're in a rush, because they have a pregnant woman in the car with them and need to get to the ER quickly. So we all act as psychologists in our own right, but the actual field of psychology attempts to apply the scientific method to it so that we can get some better than chance findings as to why people do what they do and what we see as normal, or what most people in a population would do. Let's discuss the goals of psychology. So I remember one time I asked a student what they thought the goal of psychology was, and they said to manipulate people, which was funny, but he actually was correct to some extent, but that is not the overarching goal of psychology. We'll talk about manipulation in this semester and later on in this chapter, but that's just one small facet of psychology. The overarching goal of psychology is much more positive in nature, in that we try to improve the lives of individuals and society as a whole. And those things are sort of interchangeable. The idea being that if we are able to improve the lives of individuals, this will impact society as a whole, in that as individuals start to feel better or are the best versions of themselves, in a utopian kind of idealistic way, society could then be at its best. And so we definitely all affect each other. I'm sure that you have had the experience where you're in a good mood and you go to work and a coworker's in a bad mood and they kind of kill your vibe and bring you down. And so certainly we share space and we share the way that we affect one another. And so psychology understands that the individual can have an impact on the whole. And then in terms of more specific goals of psychology, there are 4 of them. We try to describe, explain, predict, and control human behavior. So as it relates to describing behavior, the first thing the psychologist does is observes a behavior and then attempts to describe what is happening in that behavior. So if you look at the slide, you'll see an image of 2 boys. And so you might start by describing what you see in that image. Perhaps you see 2 boys engaged in some sort of physical altercation. You see some writing on the wall about, I believe it says, Jimmy's dad has halitosis. It looks like the sun is shining and they're wearing shorts. So perhaps it's a hot day outside. It looks like they are by a baseball field. So perhaps they've just played a game of baseball. And so that leads us to the next goal of psychology, which is to explain why this is happening. Maybe this is happening because this is Jimmy that's punching the redhead, and Jimmy is angry that there's this writing about his dad's bad breath on the wall and thinks the redhead did it. Perhaps this is happening because the boy just lost a game of baseball and is angry, And if we go to a deeper level, we can ask ourselves, well, why would someone resort to violence? Because they see something negative about their father, or they've lost a game of baseball. And perhaps it's because this is something that they see in their home. Maybe they come from a home where there's domestic violence, so they're acting out kind of the behavior that they see. It could be a function of Jimmy has a lot of testosterone, which would be a biological explanation for his behavior. It could be more of an environmental explanation in that it's a really hot day, and we know in psychology that as it gets hotter, we see an increase in violent crime. And this would lead us to the next goal of predicting when will it happen again. So let's say that we went with the premise that the little boy is being violent because he's angry that he lost the baseball game. We could then predict that perhaps the next time he loses a game, he'll resort to violence. And then the final goal is how can we change this behavior by controlling it. So maybe we could control Jimmy's behavior by teaching him about alternative methods to handle his anger besides violence. We could punish him. We could reward him for good behavior. There's all types of different ways that we could use psychological theories and principles to change his behavior that we find undesirable. And those are the 4 specific goals of psychology: to describe, explain, predict, and control human behavior. Again, while the overarching goal is to improve the lives of individuals and society as a whole. So to understand where we are at now in 2015 in the field of psychology, it's helpful to take a walk down history lane and see how far we've come. And so we're going to start by looking at the first method of treating mental illness. And this is just one of many primitive methods that were quite outlandish, but this was popular for many, many, many centuries. As you can see on the slide, from the 1st century all the way till the 19th century, this method of treating mental illness was really the go-to method. And it is called trephination. And the theory behind trephination is that mentally ill people had become possessed with demons, and so the way to quote-unquote cure them would be to drill a hole in the top of their head, and this would release the demons, and then you would plug up the hole with a little metal piece, and this would prevent the demons from re-entering the mind and creating the mental illness. And so at the time, the people that were considered doctors were the ones who would perform the trephination. And if you look on the slide, you can see the tools that were used throughout the centuries. At first, of course, they're very primitive, just rocks kind of shaved into structures that would allow penetration into the skull, and then more medieval. And then finally, in the 19th century, the 1800s, they became a little bit more sophisticated. And so we are going to watch a video from the show Rome that reenacts trephination. So it's pretty gory, but it is just a fake show, so it's not real blood. It's just ketchup, you know. But anyways, go ahead and take a look at trephination. If you're squeamish, feel free to look away.
This man.
Run, get a doctor.
I don't want people dying in my house.
Do as I say, woman.
So clearly trephination did not cure anyone of mental illness, but in fact rendered the victims of this medical procedure brain dead. And so while they were no longer behaving in a way that was abnormal, this was not due to some brilliant psychological cure, but instead because they had damaged the brain's ability to function. So, of course, we now have more sophisticated means of treating mental illness, which we'll talk about later on in this semester. So another field of study in psychology is personality, and there are many methods that we use to do personality testing. But let's look at the first attempt at testing personality. It was known as phrenology. It was invented by a man named Franz Gall in the early 19th century. He was actually a physician, and he believed that you could determine someone's personality by feeling the bumps on their head, and this would enable you to determine different characteristics depending on where the bumps were located and the size of the bumps. So, for example, if you had a bump just above your ear that was rather pronounced, maybe that meant that you were very impulsive. And if you had a bump above your other ear that was slightly pronounced, maybe this meant you were mildly extroverted. And so to do his phrenology, he did develop a map of the skull so that he could determine where a bump was located and then associate that with a specific characteristic. Phrenology was widely accepted for many years. There was a lot of people that believed in it. And so as it grew in popularity, tools were invented to increase the effectiveness of phrenology, such as the psychograph, which you can see here. So let's go ahead and watch a video on phrenology.
This next device was called a psychograph.
This is an antique phrenology machine invented in 1905, built in Superior, Wisconsin. It measures the bumps on a person's head to see what their personality is like.
Phrenology was one of the leading pseudosciences in the 1800s. Its idea was invented by Viennese physician Franz Joseph Gall in 1790, who believed that you could determine a person's character by measuring the bumps on their head. Dr. Gall used to see pictures of Mozart composing music leaning on his piano with his knuckle against his temple, so he figured, that must be the location of musical skills. He had two acquaintances who were low-life characters who had large bumps above their ears, so he called that part of the brain acquisitiveness. He cataloged the whole brain on these one or two anecdotal bits of information. Dr. Gall became a sensation, lecturing on this through Europe. Walt Whitman was a great supporter of phrenology and included many phrenological references in many of his poems and articles. Mark Twain, however, was a great debunker of phrenology and poked fun at it. Phrenology continued as really a parlor game for many years. In the early part of this century, it fell into disfavor. With the discovery of such things as psychology and psychiatry, they realized that our character wasn't determined by the bumps on her head.
Bill, come on over here. I need a patient to try this out today to see if it's going to work. Sit down here now. This will kind of tickle when it comes down on your head. Now it's going to rate your character 1 through 5, 1 being deficient, 5 being superior, on the 32 elements of personality that Dr. Gall invented in 1790 when he invented the idea of phrenology. Now think clean thoughts. Here we go now. Keep breathing now, you're doing fine. Well, it says you have a few things to work on. They're not too serious, though. Okay, I'll go over some highlights of what we found out here for you. There we go. This is all about you and a 75-year-old machine right here. This is a printout from your reading bill. You have a lot of sexual enthusiasm. You maybe should tone that down a little bit. Your math skills are kind of poor, though. Do you have trouble balancing your checkbook?
Yeah.
You're quite deficient in your ability to use heavy machinery. Do you run a backhoe, a forklift truck very often?
No.
And your faith is way too high, Bill. Be careful you're not swept off your feet by some evangelist. Now that's an overview of your personality.
Thanks, Bob.
You're welcome.
So obviously, psychology, as it's known today, wasn't around forever. It became a field more recently, within the last 130 years. But of course, prior to psychology becoming an official field of study, we did have interest in human behavior, as you just saw with the phrenology, as you saw with things like trephination. And then, of course, philosophers discussed ideas about human behavior and the mind-body relationship forever. We've had questions about human nature. And so an example of one of those questions is, are we born with knowledge or do we develop it through experience? And so philosophers like John Locke believed that we were born with no information whatsoever. And he referred to this as tabula rasa. So tabula rasa is Latin. It means blank slate. And we didn't always have pens and paper or printers or iPads as human beings, as you know. So before these inventions, students would write on little chalkboards called slates and turn in their homework or take notes in that fashion. And so tabula rasa means blank slate, referring to those little chalkboards. And John Locke's idea was that we came into the world knowing nothing, and then we gained information and knowledge as we experienced different things, as we were taught different things, as we learned in school, etc. And the opposing view, which was shared by Plato and Rene Descartes, even though they were centuries apart, was that we do come into the world with some basic knowledge. For example, instincts, basic reflexes, like the ability to suck, for example, as a baby. And so these types of questions have been debated for centuries. And it was questions like this that led to an interest, a need, a desire to create a field that specifically studied human behavior and cognition in an attempt to answer these philosophical questions. If I were to ask you who you thought the father of psychology was, I think most students would respond that they thought it was Sigmund Freud. However, he's not the father or the creator of psychology. He is just probably the most popular historical psychologist. The actual creator of psychology is this man, Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt, as we would say in English. He started the field of psychology in 1879, where he created the first psychology lab, as you see on the slide here. And it was his position that psychology's first research question, and what we should ultimately be trying to understand in psychology, is how we as human beings perceive the world. How is this all happening? How are we taking in the information around us? How are we experiencing life? And so he set up this lab in Germany, and then he decided to start trying to understand how we perceive the world by using a technique called objective introspection. And what he would do is he would have students come down to his lab, and he would give them a stimulus. And a stimulus is anything that produces an energy, a light, a vibration, a pressure. So he would give them some stimulus to look at, and then he would ask them what their experience of this stimulus was. And so with objective introspection, what he was looking for was the students to describe this stimulus without having any bias or subjectivity, but instead just share the thoughts that were going on in their mind without judging them in any type of way. And so if you were to describe this apple, perhaps you would say it's round, it's red, there's a little shading on the bottom. But Wilhelm Wundt was looking for a much deeper description, and so he would have students sit in his lab for hours, even days, describing one stimulus so that he could use that information maybe to find some patterns between students, and in those patterns he might be able to find some clues as to how it is that we perceive the world. Edward Titchener is noteworthy because he actually studied under Wilhelm Wundt. He was one of his students, and he was the first psychologist that we know of to bring what he had been studying with Wilhelm Wundt to America. So for all intents and purposes, we could consider him the first American psychologist. But he did show up in New York, and he began studies at Cornell, and this was sort of the first place that we had any development in the field of psychology in America. And so one of the things that he had studied under Wilhelm Wundt was this idea of objective introspection, and him and Wundt had talked a lot about what should they really be trying to accomplish with this research question, how do we perceive the world? And they thought that the answer to that would be to try to figure out the structure of the mind, and that if they could figure out the structure of the mind, this might give them some better understanding of how human beings perceive their surroundings. And so they invented this term known as structuralism, which is the idea that we should be able to take the mind and break it down into structures, sort of map the mind, if you will. So there's a certain part of your mind that is designated to vision, a certain part of your mind that's designated to sensation, emotion, etc. And so Titchener and Wundt thought that you could figure out this map of the mind or the structure of the mind by doing the objective introspection and seeing the patterns between people's responses to stimuli, and then maybe through these patterns you could locate the different parts of the mind or places in the mind where these perceptions were occurring of those stimuli. Titchener believed that with objective introspection, we shouldn't only be using stimuli to look inside the mind or to have people describe what was going on inside their mind, but also to give them non-tangible things to describe. For example, he might ask someone to describe their experience of the word sweet. So they're not given anything to visually look at, they're just told something and then asked to pull from their mind how that word makes them feel or what thoughts it evokes, so on and so forth. And he thought, again, that by doing this objective introspection, both with tangible and intangible things, you could discover the structure of the mind. However, this isn't really an effective method of studying human behavior because, as you know, the mind is not tangible. So how then do we study the structure of something that has no structure? So this is William James. A lot of people consider him the first American psychologist, as he was actually from America. And he taught the first psychology class ever at Harvard University in 1890. And being that he was teaching the first psychology class, there was no psychology textbook, so he had to write one. So the first psychology textbook written by William James was titled The Principles of Psychology. And so James was really interested in kind of what we should be doing in the field of psychology, similar to how Wundt and Titchener were interested in that. But he wasn't really on board with their ideas of structuralism. So in a response to structuralism, he coined the term functionalism and said that what we should be doing in the field of psychology is not trying to figure out the structure of something intangible like the mind, but instead we should be trying to figure out the function of the mind. Why is it that we have emotions? Why is it that we have memory? Why is it that we dream? What is the function of these mental processes in terms of how it helps us as human beings adapt and survive in the world? And so as an example of the kind of reason why we needed to be studying functionalism is that he said if you just look at the way the mind works, it doesn't work in these broken down individual components. Instead, the mind is like a river that's ever changing and flowing. And he referred to this process as a stream of consciousness, which is a term that's still very widely used and popular. But the idea of stream of consciousness is that the way our mind works is we think of one thought, which leads to the next thought, which leads to the next thought. And it's not a structured process. It's a completely fluid and unstructured process. And so we've all experienced a stream of consciousness before. Perhaps you're listening to my voice and you hear me say a word. Let's say the word is banana, and that makes you think of fruit, and then you think of the last time you ate fruit, and it was for breakfast, and then you remember that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and you wonder who coined the term breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and where did I hear that term first? Oh, it was from my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Jones. I wonder what Mrs. Jones is up to lately. I remember she used to always eat pie at lunchtime. I like pie. My favorite pie is apple pie. That reminds me of Thanksgiving. I wonder what we're going to have for dessert at Thanksgiving this year. And this is sort of how the mind works, where one thought leads to the next thought. And therefore, just by looking at the way the mind works, it should be evident that we can't break it down into component structures because perhaps there aren't these individual working structures. And so this is where the term functionalism came from, which is what William James thought we should be doing, looking at the function of the mind rather than the structure of it. So at the same time that William James was responding to structuralism, three gentlemen by the name of Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler were also coming up with their own response to structuralism, which they called Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt is not one man. Gestalt is German, and it means the whole. In regards to the way the mind works, it doesn't work in structures, but instead it works in this Gestalt way or this whole way. In other words, our memory evokes emotions, and our memory affects our dreams. And so the different layers of our mind really overlap one another. And so if we're going to look at the way the mind works, we need to look at the way the mind works in a Gestalt or whole type of way. So these Gestalt psychologists coined a quote or phrase that is very popular to this day, and that phrase is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. They were, of course, saying this in regards to the mind and as a rebuttal to structuralism. But to break that down, if you were to take your phone and you were to take it apart, so you take the screws off and you lay those down, and then you take the faceplate off and you lay that down, and then you take the back off and lie that down, and then you take the battery out and you lie that down. If I were to ask you, is your phone valuable, broken down like this, and what I would mean by that is not monetarily, but in terms of function, is your phone just as valuable in its parts as it is when it's all put together? You would, of course, say no. When it's broken down into its parts, you can't play Candy Crush, you can't play Clash of Clans, and so the phone is more valuable and works when it's all put together. And that was the idea behind Gestalt psychology, that the mind works when it's all together, and so all the different parts of the mind are working together to create our perception of the world. And Gestalt psychologists thought ultimately that's what we should be studying, is the way the mind works together as a whole to create our perception of the world. And so to show that our perception of the world is based on many different parts working together, they created these things called Gestalt images, which are different images that when we look at them, people experience them differently. So maybe you look at it and you see one thing, and I look at it and I see another thing. And what this shows is that my individual memories and emotions are working together to affect my perception of this image, while your individual emotions and perceptions and experiences, etc., are affecting your perception of these images. So not only are we all perceiving the world differently, but we are perceiving it from our own sort of internal mental processes and projecting that outward. And that's something that Gestalt psychologists intended to show with these images. So when you're looking at this first image here, you're not just seeing the individual pieces of this photograph. You're not just seeing the individual brushstrokes or lines or just the one piece of her hair. But instead, your brain is perceiving this as a whole. You're looking at it all at once and taking that in based on not only what your senses are telling you, but also your internal mental processes, like your experiences and your emotions and memories, etc. So if you look at this Gestalt image, you might see an old woman or a young woman. I'll give you a moment to look at it. You can see it either way. Okay, the young woman sort of looking over her shoulder. The old woman is looking down a little bit. She has sort of a larger nose and pronounced chin. And then we have this image here, which is a gentleman either looking to the side or looking straight forward, depending on your perception. Then, of course, we have, is this Wolverine or two Batmen? So these Gestalt images did show us that we use our whole mind when we're perceiving the world, and that we can perceive the world differently from one another, even when we're looking at the same stimulus. And that leads us to the very popular Sigmund Freud. So I like to refer to Sigmund Freud as the Rachel Ray of psychology, in that he is very famous. However, he is kind of controversial amongst psychologists, because in psychology we like to consider ourselves a valid science. And so to be a valid science, your theories and hypotheses testing has to come from the scientific method, or has to utilize the scientific method. We want the things that we are stating, the facts that we're putting out there, or the ideas that we're putting out there, we want them to be supported by science. Freud, however, didn't really do any science. He didn't use the scientific method. There was no research to support any of his theories or claims. And as a side note, he did dabble in cocaine a little bit. So I like to refer to him as the Rachel Ray of psychology, because Rachel Ray is not actually a chef. She didn't go to culinary school. She just kind of had a bubbly personality and was discovered by the executives at Food Network, and then given this show, which led to, as you know, a talk show and books and cookware and just kind of this whole cooking empire. And if you were to ask Americans who their favorite chef is, many of them would say Rachel Ray, to the frustration of actual chefs, because she didn't go to culinary school, and so she doesn't get the title of chef. She would just be called a cook. And so this is frustrating to people that actually did go to culinary school and spend the time and money and effort working towards gaining this title. And doing what they had to do to become an actual chef. And so, similarly, Sigmund Freud didn't do any of the research necessary to develop his theories. However, they are some of the most popular theories, and he's regarded as the most popular psychologist. But nonetheless, there's not really any research to support any of his theories. Nowadays, we're coming up with some interesting experiments that do lend some support in various ways to his theories, but it's way after the fact, and he definitely didn't do any of that research himself. So with that being said, Freud did develop the idea and practice of talk therapy, and to that he deserves the utmost credit, because therapy is something that is very prevalent today and very well regarded. So we'll talk a lot about Freud and his contributions to psychology throughout the semester. As you may or may not know, he's very interested in the unconscious, and he states that sexuality, sexual urges, sexual repressions make up a lot of our unconscious mind, and our unconscious mind ultimately drives our behavior, according to Freud. So we'll get into that a little more in this chapter and throughout the semester. Okay, and then finally we have Pavlov and Watson. These gentlemen are known as the fathers of behaviorism. So behaviorism is a field of psychology and an idea in psychology that believes we should really only be studying behavior and not mental processes whatsoever, that we should only be studying things that we can actually see with our own eyes, so observable action, because in science we have to test our hypotheses, and to test our hypotheses we need to work with tangible data. And so Pavlov and Watson developed a bunch of different ideas and theories about how to change behavior, manipulate behavior, and so we'll talk about those theories and principles later on in the semester when we get to chapter 5, and a little bit more this chapter. Watson's actually a pretty controversial and interesting character in the history of psychology, in that he did some pretty profound experiments. The one he's most famous for is the little Albert experiment, where he took a baby and manipulated him into having a fear of white rats, which he did not have prior to his experiment with Watson. Watson also took what he knew about manipulating behavior to the advertising world, and his ideas that he brought to the advertising world in terms of how to sell products using manipulation are still used today. All right, so those were the major players in the history of psychology, and that concludes our walk down history lane, which brings us to today. So we're going to talk now about current perspectives in psychology. So there are 7 current perspectives in the field of psychology, and these perspectives are imperative to your success in this course. It's very important that you know and understand these 7 perspectives. And so what we mean by the 7 perspectives is 7 different approaches to understanding human behavior. So as we go through these 7 perspectives, keep the question, what motivates human behavior, in your mind, and each of these perspectives is going to have a different answer to that question. So the perspectives don't all agree with each other. You don't have to agree with all the perspectives. You can agree with some of them. You can take pieces from different perspectives and combine them, as psychologists in the real world do. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 7 different current perspectives that attempt to answer the question, what motivates human behavior? Why do people act the way they do? The first perspective is the psychodynamic perspective, which was brought to us by Sigmund Freud. So to answer the question, what motivates human behavior, or why do people act the way they act, the answer, according to the psychodynamic perspective, is the unconscious. So the perspective here is that the unconscious mind motivates our behavior, and to that extent, our behavior is somewhat out of our control, because what goes on in the unconscious is unknown to us, but yet is motivating how we act, how we feel, the things we say, what we do. And so Freud, of course, believed that what happens is, as we go through our life, things that are unpleasant or hurtful or things that we don't want to think about, we sort of sweep under the rug. And then the more stuff that we sweep and sweep and sweep under the rug eventually starts to change the shape of the rug. So to that extent, might start causing us to have mental illness or act differently. And so if we want to be our true selves, we have to sweep out that stuff under the rug, or go into our unconscious and kind of work through what's in there, causing the shape of the rug to change, or causing our behavior to change, or causing mental illness within us. And we have to clear it out. And the way to do that would be through going to therapy, through dream interpretation, and a bunch of other techniques, which we will talk about later. So he has this famous quote, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." So you can repress your feelings, you can sweep them under the rug, but they will affect behavior eventually, according to Freud. And so one of the ways in which our unconscious will reveal itself to us is with Freudian slips. And so Freudian slips are when you sort of say something you didn't intend to say. So when something from your unconscious kind of slips out. For example, my husband used to smoke cigarettes, and while he was quitting smoking cigarettes, we were at a party one time, and he was telling a story about a bug bite that he got. And so he was saying, I was just sitting there on the grass, and I looked over, and there was this giant cigarette on me. And everyone was kind of like, what? What did you mean? And he said, a giant spider was on me. A giant spider was on me. And they said, no, you said cigarette. So this is an example of a Freudian slip. What was on his unconscious mind was smoking, and so in the middle of a story, this unconscious sort of slipped out without his control over it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a video and where people are saying things they didn't intend to say, and we can ask ourselves the question about human behavior, why did they say that? And if you are of the psychodynamic perspective, you might say that what they said was a Freudian slip, meaning what they said was something that was on their mind and they didn't intend for it to come out, but it did come out. If you disagree with the psychodynamic perspective, then maybe you're saying that there's nothing to these Freudian slips, there's nothing to what they're saying, it's just an articulation error, a simple, meaningless mistake. This video does have explicit sexual content and verbally, so just be forewarned if you're sensitive to that. But this is in true Freudian fashion. He was very much into how sexual urges and repressions affect our behavior.
Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, and the rest of the team will be back at practice today. They could play either the Boston Celtics or the Philadelphia 69ers.
We'll toss it back to you guys. And Aaron, again, congratulations on your big Hooters. Hoosiers win.
Happy thought defensively, the team started slowly not picking up Portland's dribble penetration.
According to Friday's Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the state of Virginia is going to seek to indict Vic.
I look at Lon Kruger leaving Vegas to go to Oklahoma. That's a building job. He'll get it going. Mike Montgomery at Cal and what he's going to try to do in the Pac-10. All these guys have had sex before.
We'll see what happens at the end of the year.
Chris, congratulations on your success.
Right. Speaking of getting arrested, what favorite NFL team is trying to set a record for most players arrested?
He did not finish Saturday's game against Detroit. An MRI reveals a bulging disc in his lower back.
The clock is one of the things you're looking at, obviously. Kevin, the first thing I always looked at was the play clock. You got to be aware of that.
And whatever employer that we have that controls the bleep function, that one, you have to make sure.
Last night's dismantling of Ohio State by the Gators, proving the SEC is indeed the toughest conference in the country.
And just in case White Sox fans haven't suffered enough, here's 1-4 for you. Royals' Mike Moustakas, a two-run homer off of Zach Stewart, one of his 18 hits, waved the white flag.
So the next perspective is the behavioral perspective, and it argues that what motivates human behavior is the environment. So we are the way we are because of the environment in which we were raised and also the environment in which we currently exist. And so there's three main facets to this perspective: associations, observations, and rewards and punishments, meaning that our behavior is a product of these three things. So within our environment. So the associations we make within our environment affect our behavior. For example, if you look at the slide here, you see Bridget Jones eating a gallon of ice cream after being dumped and experiencing negative emotions. So the question then is, how do we create this association between food and comfort? And you could argue, if you are of the behavioral perspective, that from the moment that we are born, when we cry, we are given milk. And so early on, we establish this association that when we are upset, we eat food and we feel better. And so these associations are dictating our behavior. Also, observations can motivate our behavior, the argument being that we are just a product of what we see. And there's a lot of research to support this, that if you grow up in a home where there's alcohol abuse, you're more likely to abuse alcohol when you are an adult. If you grow up in a home where there's lots of affection, you're likely to grow into an affectionate person. And then the final component of our environment that affects our behavior, according to the behavioral perspective, is rewards and punishments. The idea being that if we are reinforced or rewarded for a behavior, we will do that behavior again, and if we are punished for a behavior, we will cease to do that behavior. And so reinforcements and rewards don't have to be monetary or tangible. A reinforcement could be something like a high five or someone saying good job or smiling at us. And a punishment could be someone saying something mean or frowning at us. And so if you are a shy person, perhaps you grew up in an environment where you were punished, so to speak, for speaking. Maybe when you would speak up, you were told children are to be seen and not heard, or you're made fun of. And so this has caused you to develop into a shy person. So using this perspective and this perspective only, if we wanted to hypothesize an answer to the question, why did Chris Brown abuse Rihanna? And granted, I know nothing about Chris Brown or Rihanna or the situation. We're just playing pretend, hypothesizing, using this perspective solely. So using these three components, we could say that maybe Chris Brown has made some sort of association between anger and hitting. Maybe that's what he observed in his home. Maybe he grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. And maybe because he exists in a hip-hop world where women are objectified and their feelings not necessarily considered, maybe being abusive towards women is in some ways rewarding in that it does facilitate the culture of some hip-hop songs. I know that there are more positive songs out there, but there are some songs in the music industry that degrade and objectify women. And for those songs, the artists are rewarded with money and fame. And so you can make the argument that that would be the reward that he would be getting for treating or mistreating Rihanna in this way. The next perspective is the humanistic perspective. This perspective believes that we all have our own free will and are individual, unique snowflakes, and therefore what motivates human behavior or the reason that we do the things we do is entirely up to us. We make decisions as we go through our lives. We are the captain of our own ship. We are in control. And so each individual person is in control of their behavior. And so at every moment, they're choosing what motivates them to act and behave in certain ways. Sort of the father of this perspective is Abraham Maslow, and he's most well known for this pyramid you see here called the hierarchy of needs. And he argues that what motivates our behavior is these 5 needs, and so we all have these needs, but as individual people, we go about meeting these needs in different ways, and it's that individuality that is being referenced when we say that the person themselves is what motivates their own behavior. So at the most basic level, we have our physiological needs, our need for air, water, food, sleep, sex. And so the way we go about meeting those needs varies from person to person. At the next level, we have our basic safety needs, safety and security, which is the need to be in an environment in which we feel secure and safe, in a good neighborhood, in a home that's secure and safe, driving a car that's secure and safe. And we will, after our physiological needs are met, start behaving in such a way that will meet these safety and security needs. After those needs are met, we start working towards meeting needs like love and belongingness, trying to have relationships, signing up for Match.com or Tinder, just kidding. But having relationships or going to church or going to school or finding some community to belong to. And then after those needs are met, we start striving for the next set of needs, which are self-esteem needs. And so these needs are needs to achieve, to be good at something, to be recognized for your works and for your talents and for your abilities. And then at the tippy top of the pyramid is the human need to be self-actualized, which Maslow believed we all had. and this is to be self-actualized means to be a fully functioning person. In other words, to have reached your full potential. People that are self-actualized are often experience what are known as peak experiences, and this gets a little existential and esoteric, but peak experiences are they fall on a continuum. So it could be anything from just feeling extremely happy, like you're on drugs even though you haven't ingested any drugs, to having an out-of-body experience. And so Maslow says that we can kind of go up and down this pyramid throughout our lives, that very few people ever become self-actualized, but the main point being that we all attempt to meet these needs in order, one at a time, from the bottom to the top, and we do it in different ways depending on our own individuality. So the humanistic perspective also believes that at our core we are good, so we are born good, and we are just doing our best to survive and adapt in our environment and meet these needs on the pyramid, and if we are quote-unquote bad, it's because of the way that our environment has treated us or disregarded these basic human needs. Okay, so if we were to look at Al Capone, and again, I don't know anything about Al Capone other than I believe he was abandoned as a child, so we can use that to theorize how he became a gang member from this perspective. So we would need to look at the pyramid, and maybe we would say that being a gang member satisfied his physiological needs because it provided him through selling drugs or guns or whatever he sold. It gave him money to gain food and a safe place to sleep. He had access to women and sex because he was the leader of this gang, and with that power came those sort of perks, so to speak. And then safety and security could be obtained by being a gang member because he had lots of people surrounding him with weapons and keeping him safe. Love and belongingness. A lot of people that join gangs say that they got a sense of family and belongingness out of being in that gang, and that was the main reason that they stayed in it. And so we could argue that he got that camaraderie and friendship and loyalty and sense of love from the people in the gang with him. Self-esteem, being the leader of the gang, he probably felt a lot of power, and so he gained some self-esteem from that power. I don't know if I'd venture to say he was self-actualized, but we could definitely theorize that this is why he became a gang member in regards to the humanistic perspective. The next perspective is the cognitive perspective, and this perspective believes that what motivates our behavior are our thoughts. So the cognitive perspective is very much interested in the process of thought, how we see the world, how does that perception influence our behavior, and the cognitive perspective likes to use the analogy of the human computer. And so the human computer is the idea that the way we take in information through our senses is analogous to like a keyboard. The way we retrieve information is analogous to the way memory works in the brain. The way we transform information is the way perception and consciousness works. And then the way we store information is also a function of memory. And so in the cognitive perspective, they use this idea that the brain functions like a computer to help kind of explain the functions of the mental processes. But the overarching idea behind the cognitive perspective is that thoughts really motivate our actions, and that thoughts are very powerful. So a famous study was done on water molecules, and we are going to watch a video now that argues, as this study did, that thoughts are so powerful that they can change the shape of water molecules, and kind of extrapolating from that idea, we could argue that our thoughts also affect our behavior in the same way that they affected this behavior of these water molecules.
For the past week, I've been expressing kind thoughts, staying positive, and listening to peaceful classical music whenever I could. Not trying to impress anyone, I'm just trying to make myself more physically attractive. You think I'm delusional? Well, I have proof it works. Japanese scientist Dr. Masaru Emoto froze distilled water and observed them under the microscope after exposing them to different things, such as music, words, pictures, and thoughts. You get the idea. Here, a distilled water crystal that has not been exposed to any elements looks like a plain hexagon. After Pastoral by Beethoven was played to the water, it formed a crystal like this. Looks very complex and delicate, doesn't it? And for all of you Beatle fans out there, here's the crystal formed from John Lennon's Imagine. It looks like a small silver flower. Now, when the water is exposed to a heavy metal song, it didn't form crystals at all. It just looks coarse and dented like a rocky surface. And this is my favorite. When the water is exposed to Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel, the crystals formed look like this, a broken heart, just like the lyrics in the song. Now that Dr. Emoto has some fascinating results with music, he took the experiment to the next level, showing different written words through the water. Here's the water crystal formed after being shown the words love and gratitude. Look how intricate and brilliant the hexagon structure is. It's like a diamond. And here's the one for the word thank you, truth, and eternal. Check out this eternal one. It even has an internal structure. Pretty awesome. They all look so beautiful and each one is unique. Now for the negative phrase such as you disgust me, the water didn't form any crystals. Instead, it looks disintegrated with no structure at all. Dr. Emoto tried different languages as well, and the results were the same. So I guess it's not really the words, but the emotions behind them. Prayer also has an effect on water. Here's a picture of the water crystals taken from the polluted Fujiwara Dam. And no joke, here it is after a Buddhist prayer has been offered to the water. The transformation is astonishing. We don't know exactly what it is, but the prayers definitely had some positive energy that transformed the water and gave it its beautiful structure. The patterns are not only affected by sounds, but also pictures. When photos of the sun, Niagara Falls, and dolphins are exposed to the water, the crystals formed look stunning and beautiful. Now Dr. Emoto takes the experiment to the extreme. His last step is human thoughts. The question he is asking is, does human thought have the power to change water molecules? So he got his team, they intentionally focused positive thoughts and feelings for weeks and months on the water. As a result, the water crystals turned out to be just as beautiful as their thoughts. And on the contrary, when the group tried with negative thoughts, the results showed deformed crystals or no crystals at all.
Okay, the next perspective is the sociocultural perspective, and this perspective argues that we are the way we are because of the society and culture in which we develop and exist. And so I like to ask students, I teach critical thinking, and I like to ask my students in my critical thinking class if they think that they would be the same person, have the same likes and dislikes, same morals, same religious beliefs, same behaviors if they grew up in a different country, in a different culture. And generally people kind of look at it and think, well, maybe not. Maybe I wouldn't dress the same. Maybe I wouldn't eat the same foods. Maybe I wouldn't speak the same way. Maybe I wouldn't even have the same morals or religious beliefs. And so in the sociocultural perspective, we're interested in this idea of how we are shaped as human beings and how we behave and think as a result of the society and culture in which we develop. So in the sociocultural perspective, we look at things like kinesphere. How close do we stand to each other based on the culture in which we exist? So in America, our kinesphere is like 3 feet. In China, the kinesphere is about 1 foot. And so the sociocultural perspective might ask what accounts for that and might find that it is because of the overpopulation in China, for example. So the sociocultural perspective not only takes into account the culture in which we exist, but also just basic ways in which people behave in groups in terms of the societal aspect. So social norms, groups, relationships, social roles, and how that affects our behavior. So what we're going to do now is we are going to watch a video that is very disturbing. It is of a little girl in China, and she is run over by a truck twice, or a van, 2 different vans. And she actually, just so everyone's okay, she does survive this. It doesn't show the aftermath in the video, but she does end up being okay. But she is run over and in this kind of open air market, and no one actually comes to her aid to help her. So we're going to watch the video, and then after the video we'll talk about why, from the sociocultural perspective, no one came to this little girl's aid. Please be warned that this is actual footage of this little girl being run over, so it is disturbing. It's not pleasant to watch. If you are squeamish or feel like you'll be negatively affected by watching the video, then just go ahead and fast forward through this part.
There's been worldwide condemnation after vision from China emerged showing a toddler involved in a hit and run. No less than 18 people can be seen ignoring the girl as she lay injured on the ground.
2-year-old Yu Yu had wandered away from her mother in a busy Foshan market. A moment later, this white van knocks her over. In a scene too shocking to show, the driver stops and carries on, leaving the toddler injured and bleeding on the road. This man is the first person on the scene, but instead of stopping to help, he walks away. A moment later, another person passes on a bike and another looks but walks the other way. Then a second vehicle runs over the girl, and over the next few minutes, no less than 18 people walk, ride or drive past the injured girl. Some pause to look, but no one helps. Finally, a rubbish collector stops and calls authorities. Yu Yu was taken to hospital with critical head injuries.
Her condition is very grave. When she arrived here, she couldn't breathe on her own.
Her parents are understandably distraught, and the incident has sparked millions of comments on Chinese websites, many asking what has happened to China's humanity. Some, however, say it's evidence of a society too poor to help, frightened of what it would cost should they be blamed. Police, meanwhile, have detained the 2 drivers involved.
Okay, so the video sort of pointed out some cultural explanations or hypotheses for why no one helped the little girl. Additional theories on why no one helped the little girl is that in China there's a limit to the number of children you're allowed to have, and so many people would prefer to have a male. The thought behind that being that the male child can carry on the family name and may be better equipped to take care of aging parents. And in countries where these limitations exist, many females are murdered by their parents or left so that they can negate the fact or ignore the fact that they had this female child and try again for a male child. And so in cultures like this, we might argue that females are less valued, and so China being a country where there is a limitation on the number of children allowed, and this being a little girl that needed help, perhaps this is why she was left alone. From a societal standpoint, there is something called the bystander effect that happens regardless of culture, even here in America, which is that when someone's in need of help, they're much more likely to obtain that help if they are with just one other person versus being with a group of people. So if you're in a group and one person gets hurt or needs help, we tend to look around at each other and think, oh, maybe this person's more equipped to help. Maybe someone else is going to do it. Maybe somebody's already called 911. As opposed to if we are just alone with a person in need of help, then we don't have that diffusion of responsibility, and we know that we do have to take action or should take action. And so because this little girl was kind of in this open air market with lots of people around, perhaps the bystander effect took place. And that's a societal norm, happens regardless of culture. Okay, so the next perspective is the biopsychological perspective. This perspective argues that what motivates human behavior is biology, which includes our hormones, any brain damage, disease, heredity, and brain chemicals, all being the major contributing factors to why we act the way we act. So looking first at hormones, we've all been around someone who is having PMS or is pregnant and know that the hormonal changes associated with that can bring about different emotions. It can affect behavior, certainly. We know that the most common age of violent criminals is 19 years old, and we also find that these 19-year-olds that commit the most violent crimes tend to be big, muscular males. And so it is that same exact population who coincidentally has the highest level of testosterone, 19-year-old muscular men. Then we have brain damage, and so we know certainly that any brain damage can affect the way someone behaves. So perhaps you know someone who has taken drugs, too many drugs, and it has affected their behavior. We definitely see that with extended methamphetamine use, even after using methamphetamines and no longer using it, being sober, people still tend to have paranoid behaviors, thinking people are coming after them, thinking people are out to get them, and this is due to the brain damage afflicted with the methamphetamines. Also, we know that disease can affect behavior. For example, Alzheimer's is a degenerative disease that eats away at the cerebral cortex in the brain, and this can cause people to have memory loss, dementia. There's also a recent case of a man who was in his 50s, and his whole life he was quote-unquote normal sexually. He just had sex with his wife without anything that we might consider sexually deviant. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, he started feeling a sexual attraction towards children. And so he didn't act on it in terms of, he didn't physically touch a child, but he was consuming child pornography. And this went on for about a year. He had a doctor's appointment, and at that doctor's appointment, they discovered that he had a tumor in his brain. And so, long story short, they removed the tumor, and his urges towards children went away. And he researched into that, and the doctor explained to him that he actually had a tumor pressing on the sexual centers of his brain, and that could have been causing his urges towards children. 10 years later, he started feeling those urges towards children again, and he immediately went to the doctor, and that tumor had come back in the same spot. They removed it, and he no longer had those urges. We also know that heredity affects our behavior. There's something called the warrior gene. 1 in 3 men have the warrior gene, and this is definitely genetic. People that have the warrior gene have more aggressive tendencies. There's also an impulsivity gene. If you have this gene, you're more likely to be impulsive, which means like you don't think before you act or before you speak always. And then we have brain chemicals. So we have neurotransmitters in our brains, which is a fancy way of saying brain chemicals, and these chemicals can affect our behavior and do affect our behavior. If you look at this brain scan on the slide, you see a depressed brain versus a not depressed brain. So depression is essentially the shortage of a brain chemical called serotonin, which is the chemical that makes us feel happy. And so the brain on the left has low levels of serotonin, and the brain on the right has a normal amount of serotonin. And the serotonin is expressed with those yellow and orange colors. So we're going to talk about the Tower of Texas sniper case. So a gentleman by the name of Charles Whitman in the 50s was going around and shooting people. He shot his mother and his wife, I believe, and then climbed to the top of a tower at the University of Texas and shot 12 other people from that tower with a sniper rifle, and then shot himself. But before he shot himself, he actually wrote a note to the cops, which I've never read, so I'm just paraphrasing it. But essentially it said something to the effect of, I feel a pressure on my brain, and I believe that that pressure is making me have homicidal thoughts and is what led me to kill all these people. So please do an autopsy on my brain and see if that is what caused it for the sake of science. And then he shot himself in the chest so that they could do an autopsy and look at his brain. And that is exactly what they did. And they did, in fact, find a tumor pressing on the amygdala, which is the aggression center of our brain. And so the biopsychological perspective might argue that the reason why, or one of the main reasons why, the Tower of Texas sniper murdered all those people is because he had a biological issue in his brain, the tumor pressing on his amygdala, making him aggressive. And the last perspective is the evolutionary perspective. This perspective argues that what motivates human behavior is our need to adapt, survive, and reproduce. And so it focuses on universal mental characteristics that all humans share. And so this perspective looks at mental strategies like why we lie, mate selection, fear, etc., and attempts to explain these behaviors from a very Darwinistic standpoint, that we do engage in behaviors that benefit our adaptation and our ability to survive in our environment and produce offspring. So, for example, an experiment in 2002 looked at which type of infidelity each gender is more likely to forgive. And what it found is that men are more likely to forgive emotional infidelity and women are more likely to forgive sexual infidelity. And so if we were to explain that using the evolutionary perspective, what we might say is that men are more willing to forgive emotional infidelity because the idea of their mate having sex with someone else violates their ability to know that the offspring that they could or have had with this woman is actually theirs. So women are more likely to forgive sexual infidelity because it is the emotional infidelity that's most crushing to women, because women need to know that a man is committed to them emotionally so that they will stay and take care of the child that they have created with this man. And if he's giving his emotional resources to someone else, then perhaps he's not going to be invested in taking care of the child. So the idea behind the evolutionary perspective is that we have these instinctual behaviors kind of wired in us that are there to help us survive and reproduce. And these behaviors are unconscious and are dictating how we act, how we feel, in a way that we're not necessarily aware of, but are hardwired to help us adapt to our environment. Okay, at this point, I want you to go ahead and pause the video, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 1, and once you have completed that activity, come back to this point in the video to continue the lecture. Okay, so let's talk now about working in psychology, how much you can make, where you can work, different types of psychologists. So let's begin by talking about the different types of psychologists. In a broad sense, there are psychiatrists, and psychiatrists are medical doctors who can prescribe medicine. Psychologists do not. So if you look at the picture, you can see kind of the doctor writing where it says psychiatrist, and then you can imagine those dots above the eyes as little pills to help you remember that psychiatrists are the only type of psychologist that can prescribe medicine. A psychoanalyst, if you've heard that term before, is a psychiatrist or psychologist that specializes in Freud's theories and techniques in therapy. There is what's known as a psychiatric social worker. Generally, these people have a master's of social work, and they work in clinics and hospitals, like Patton State Hospital, for example, which is a hospital in San Bernardino that mainly treats people that have been put there because they have been deemed legally insane, often have committed a crime, and so the social workers would, a psychiatric social worker would work there and help people with schizophrenia or sexual offenders that have been hospitalized. Then there is what is known as a psychologist, and this is a person that does not have any medical training, but they hold a degree, either a PhD or a PsyD, which are both a doctorate level degree. The difference between the PhD and the PsyD is that the PhD is more of a research degree, which requires a dissertation, which is basically a very long book on research that you have done and is written by you. And then a PsyD is also a doctorate, but it focuses specifically on the treatment of psychological disorders. there is a psychologist known as a marriage and family therapist, in which you can get a master's degree and provide therapy to typical relationship and family type problems, but you would not be diagnosing mental illness or treating severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia or depression or anything like that. Then there is a Master's of Science, which is what I have in mine, for example, is in Industrial Organizational Psychology, and a Master's of Science requires a thesis, which is also, much like a dissertation, a book written by you on research that you have conducted. So psychologists can work in clinics, mental health centers, counseling centers. As you can see on the little pie chart, most psychologists work in colleges and universities because it is there that they are able to do all facets of their expertise, like teach, do research, and then do practical application. For example, as an IO psychologist, I was hired by Cal State San Bernardino to work on an externship program while also teaching there and doing research for my thesis. So you can see that private practice, which is where you are a therapist and you have your own office, is one of the smaller pieces of the pie, but I think most people probably think that that's what most psychologists do. So there are lots of different types of psychologists, and the amount of money that they make in a year varies greatly between the different types. So if you are a psychology major and you're trying to figure out what field of psychology you want to specialize in, you can Google or go on the internet and look up different types of psychologists, school psychologists, forensic psychologists, sports psychologists, etc., and then see how much they make in your area. You can go on simplyhired.com, type in your zip code, and then it will tell you how much the different types of psychologists make on average in the city that you live in. You can also kind of see what different psychology careers are hot. There are different psychology fields that kind of get popular at different times, and then based on their popularity, there's more potential for income. So those are all things that you can look up if you're interested in getting a career in psychology. So we're going to talk about the different types of psychologists that there are in the world. If you are a psychology major or interested in becoming a psychologist, these are the different types of psychologists that you could become. And so they are varied, and there's many of them. We'll start with counseling psychology. So counseling psychologists make up about 13% of the psychology pie. So if you take all the different psychologists in the world, about 13% of them are counseling psychologists. And they focus on educational, social, and career adjustment problems. They often work at schools and colleges, universities. So if you've gone to a counselor, you've probably seen a counseling psychologist, but they can help you decide what major you should take, what career might suit you. If you're having a bad day at school, you can go see them and they can kind of get you through that tough moment. If you need some longer term therapy or counseling, you would go to what's called a clinical psychologist, and these are kind of the therapists as we picture them and see them in the movies, right? So if you wanted to go talk to a therapist about any of your problems, be it relationship problems, work problems, or if you're having some type of mental illness, OCD, schizophrenia, depression, you would go see a clinical psychologist. And they study, diagnose, and treat psychological disorders as well as just everyday issues from breakups to depression. So clinical psychologists make up about 34% of the people working in psychology. And then there are health psychologists. And health psychology is one of those fields that is kind of on the rise. So health psychologists study the relationship between the mind and the body, or how what's going on in the mind affects your physical health. And so there's been a lot of interesting research that shows that this relationship is a very, very strong and profound relationship that the mind and the body are one unit and should not be separated in terms of how we treat illness. And so we see different medical organizations such as Kaiser starting these campaigns, like the Thrive campaign, for example, if you're familiar with that, that focus on treating the whole patient, not only what's going on in their body, but also if you do have Kaiser, you go to a doctor's appointment and they ask you questions about, do you exercise? How are you feeling? They're interested in not only what goes on in your body, but also what goes on in your mind. And that is really in part because of the push of health psychologists for these different medical organizations to treat the whole patient and not separate the body from the mind, but understand that they are one unit and they interact. Could also be a sports psychologist, and a sports psychologist works with athletes to help them maintain their highest levels of athletic performance, get over any sort of mental blocks that might be inhibiting their performance. Phil Jackson of the Lakers was very widely known to use a lot of the sports psychology techniques such as mental imagery or visualization and other strategies employed by sports psychologists. And then there are industrial organizational psychologists, which is the type of psychologist that I am. We are generally hired by companies to help increase employee output and productivity, increase morale, help with hiring procedures to get the right employee in the right position, things like that. All right, there are also experimental psychologists that do research on psychological topics such as sensation, learning, perception, thinking. They might do research on using ecstasy to treat soldiers coming back from war with PTSD. They might do research on lucid dreaming, things of that nature. So most of their workday is centered around doing research and then discussing their research in scientific settings. There's also cognitive psychologists, which study primarily higher mental processes or complex mental processes like problem solving, riddles, puzzles, critical thinking. So what they're really interested in is how does the brain work in terms of mental processes that take more of a concerted effort on your brain's part. So like when you are solving a puzzle, like the one you see on the slide here, what exactly is going on in your mind? What brain mechanisms are you utilizing? What's the process in which that occurs, etc. There are personality psychologists, and personality psychologists are interested in researching and understanding the different personality traits that make up a human being, the characteristics that we have in common, the different scales or continuums in which those characteristics can exist within humans. So a major task is just identifying all of the different personality traits that exist. And then another task of personality psychologists is to create valid and reliable personality tests, similar to the one you took at the beginning of the semester, the Myers-Briggs test instrument that rendered you those 4 letters. And then there are developmental psychologists, and developmental psychologists study the ways in which humans are similar and different across the lifespan from conception all the way till death, and they attempt to organize and understand those similarities by categorizing them and researching them in depth. So we know that people tend to have similar life cycles, like we tend to, most teenagers tend to have kind of that teenage angst. A lot of people have midlife crises, empty nest syndrome. When someone dies, many people go through the 5 stages of grief, which include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And so developmental psychologists look at the ways in which humans are similar and different, and usually find that we are more similar than we are different by far. All right, and the last areas of specialization we're going to talk about, although there are many more, like forensic psychology, child psychology, but the last 2 we're going to touch on is social psychology, which studies the way that people's thoughts, feelings, and actions are affected by others. So social psychologists study things like love, what makes us love one person over another person. They look at things like cults, conformity, persuasion, violence, anything that has to do with the social aspects of being a human. And then there is cross-cultural psychology that looks at the ways in which people behave in different cultures, the different social norms and behavioral norms across cultures. All right, now we are going to move into kind of the second part of Chapter 1, which focuses on research in psychology. Psychology does want to be respected as a science, and to do so there is an expectation that you use the scientific method and you can support your theories and claims with research that is valid and reliable, and again based on science and some quantitative measurement, meaning there's some math done as well, which is why in psychology we employ the use of statistics, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But to start off this discussion, let's go ahead and watch a crash course video on research in psychology.
Can we cold pizza cause psychedelic hallucinations? Does coffee make you smarter? Or does it just make you do dumb stuff faster? Like much of psychology itself, questions like these can seem pretty intuitive. I mean, people may not be the easiest organisms to understand, but you're a person, right? So you must be qualified to draw, like, some conclusions about other people and what makes them tick. But it's important to realize that your intuition isn't always right. In fact, sometimes it is exactly wrong, and we tend to grossly underestimate the dangers of false intuition. If you have some idea about a person and their behavior that turns out to be right, that reinforces your trust in your intuition. Like if I warn my buddy Bob against eating that deep dish pizza that's been in the fridge for the past week, but he eats it anyway and soon starts to wig out, I'm gonna say, dude, I told you so. But if I'm wrong and he's totally fine, I probably won't even think about it ever again. This is known as hindsight bias, or the I knew it all along phenomenon. This doesn't mean that common sense is wrong, it just means that our intuitive sense more easily describes what just happened than what will happen in the future. Another reason you can't blindly trust your intuition is your natural tendency toward overconfidence. Sometimes you just really feel like you're right about people when actually you're really wrong. We've all been there. We also tend to perceive order in random events, which can lead to false assumptions. For example, if you flip a coin 5 times, you have equal chances of getting all tails as you do getting alternating heads and tails. But we see the series of 5 tails as something unusual, as a streak, and thus giving that result some kind of meaning that it very definitely does not have. That is why we have the methods and safeguards of psychological research and experimentation, and the glorious process of scientific inquiry. They help us to get around these problems and basically save the study of our minds from the stupidity of our minds. So I hope that it won't be a spoiler if I tell you now that pizza won't make you trip, and coffee doesn't make you smart. Sorry. In most ways, psychological research is no different than any other scientific discipline. Like, step 1 is always figuring out how to ask general questions about your subject and turn them into measurable, testable propositions. This is called operationalizing your questions. So you know how the scientific method works. It starts with a question and a theory. And I don't mean theory in the sense of like a hunch that, say, a quad shot of espresso makes you think better. Instead, in science, a theory is what explains and organizes lots of different observations and predicts outcomes. And when you come up with a testable prediction, that's your hypothesis. Once your theory and hypothesis are in place, you need a clear and common language to report them with. So, for example, defining exactly what you mean by thinking better with your espresso hypothesis will allow other researchers to replicate the experiment. And replication is key. You can watch a person exhibit a certain behavior once, and it won't prove very much, but if you keep getting consistent results even as you change subjects or situations, you're probably onto something. This is a problem with one popular type of psychological research, case studies, which take an in-depth look at one individual. Case studies can sometimes be misleading because by their nature they can't be replicated, so they run the risk of overgeneralizing. Still, they're good at showing us what can happen and end up framing questions for more extensive and generalizable studies. They're also often memorable and a great storytelling device psychologists use to observe and describe behavior. Like, say the smell of coffee makes Carl suddenly anxious and irritable. That obviously doesn't mean that it has that same effect on everyone. In fact, Carl has terrible memories associated with that smell, and so his case is actually quite rare. Poor Carl. But you would still have to look at lots of other cases to determine that conclusively. Another popular method of psychological research is naturalistic observation, where researchers simply watch behavior in a natural environment, whether that's chimps poking anthills in the jungle, kids clowning in a classroom, or drunk dudes yelling at soccer games. The idea is to let the subjects just do their thing without trying to manipulate or control the situation. So yeah, basically just spying on people. Like case studies, naturalistic observations are great at describing behavior, but they're very limited in explaining it. Psychologists can also collect behavioral data using surveys or interviews, asking people to report their opinions and behaviors. Sexuality researcher Alfred Kinsey famously used this technique when he surveyed thousands of men and women on their sexual history and published his findings in a pair of revolutionary texts, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Female, respectively. Surveys are a great way to access people's consciously held attitudes and beliefs, but how to ask the questions can be tricky. Subtle word choices can influence results. For example, more forceful words like ban or censor may elicit different reactions than limit or not allow. Asking, do you believe in space aliens, is a much different question than, do you think that there is intelligent life somewhere else in the universe? It's the same question, but in the first, the subject might assume that you mean aliens visiting Earth and making crop circles and abducting people and poking them. And if how you phrase surveys is important, so is who you ask. I could ask a room full of students at a pacifist club meeting what they think about arms control, but the results wouldn't be a representative measure of where students stand because there's a pretty clear sampling bias at work here. To fairly represent a population, I'd need to get a random sample where all members of the target group, in this case students, had an equal chance of being selected to answer the question. So, once you've described behavior with surveys, case studies, or naturalistic observation, you can start making sense out of it and even predict future behavior. One way to do that is to look at how one trait or behavior is related to another, or how they correlate. So let's get back to my buddy Bob, who seems to think that his refrigerator is actually some kind of time machine that can preserve food indefinitely. Let's say that Bob is just tucked into a lunch of questionable leftovers, pizza that may very well have had a little bit of fungus on it, but he was hungry and lazy, and so he doused it in sriracha. Suddenly, he starts seeing things. Green armadillos with laser beam eyes. From here, we could deduce that eating unknown fungus predicts hallucination. That's a correlation, but correlation is not causation. Yes, it makes sense that eating questionable fungus would cause hallucinations, but it's possible that Bob was already on the verge of a psychotic episode, and those fuzzy leftovers were actually benign. Or there could be an entirely different factor involved, like maybe he hadn't slept in 72 hours or had an intense migraine coming on, and one of those factors caused his hallucinations. It's tempting to draw conclusions from correlations, but it's super important to remember that correlations predict the possibility of cause and effect relationships. They cannot prove them. So we've talked about how to describe behavior without manipulating it, and how to make connections and predictions from those findings, but that can only take you so far. To really get to the bottom of cause and effect behaviors, you're gonna have to start experimenting. Experiments allow investigators to isolate different effects by manipulating an independent variable and keeping all other variables constant, or as constant as you can. This means that they need at least two groups: the experimental group, which is gonna get messed with, and the control group, which is not gonna get messed with. Just as surveys use random samples, experimental researchers need to randomly assign participants to each group to minimize potential confounding variables or outside factors that may skew the results. You don't want all grumpy teenagers in one group and all wealthy Japanese surfers in the other. They gotta mingle. Now, sometimes one or both groups are not informed about what's actually being tested. For example, researchers can test how substances affect people by comparing their effects to placebos or inert substances. And often, the researchers themselves don't know which group is experimental and which is control, so they don't unintentionally influence the results through their own behavior. In which case, it's called, you guessed it, a double-blind procedure. So let's put these ideas into practice in our own little experiment. Like all good work, it starts with a question. So the other day, my friend Bernice and I were debating. We're debating caffeine's effect on the brain. Personally, she's convinced that coffee helps her focus and think better, but I get all jittery like a caged meerkat and can't focus on anything. And because we know that overconfidence can lead you to believe things that are not true, we decided to do some critical thinking. So let's figure out our question. Do humans solve problems faster when given caffeine? Now we gotta boil that down into a testable prediction. Remember, keep it clear, simple, and eloquent so that it can be replicated. Caffeine makes me smarter is not a great hypothesis. A better one would be, say, adult humans given caffeine will navigate a maze faster than humans not given caffeine. The caffeine dosage is your independent variable, the thing that you can change. So, you'll need some coffee. Your result or dependent variable, the thing that depends on the thing that you can change, is going to be the speed at which the subject navigates this giant corn maze. maze. Go out on the street, wrangle up a bunch of different kinds of people, and randomly assign them into 3 different groups. Also, at this point, the American Psychological Association suggests that you acquire everyone's informed consent to participate. You don't want to force anyone to be in your experiment, no matter how cool you think it is. So the control group gets a placebo, in this case decaf. Experimental group 1 gets a low dose of caffeine, which we'll define at 100 milligrams, just an eye-opener and like a cup of coffee's worth. Experimental group 2 gets 500 milligrams, more than a quad shot of espresso dunked in a Red Bull. Once you dose everyone, turn them loose in the maze and wait at the other end with a stopwatch. All that's left is to measure your results from the 3 different groups and compare them to see if there were any conclusive results. If the highly dosed folks got through it twice as fast as the low dose or placebo groups, then Bernice's hypothesis was correct and she could rub my face in it saying she was right all along, but really, that would just be the warm flush of hindsight bias telling her something she didn't really know until we tested it. Then, because we've used clear language and defined our parameters, other curious minds can easily replicate this experiment and we can eventually pool all the data together and have something solid to say about what that macchiato was doing to your cognition, or at least the speed at which you can run through a maze. Science. Probably the best tool that you have for understanding other people. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course Psychology. If you paid attention, you learned how to apply the scientific method to psychological research through case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, and interviews and experimentation. You also learned about different kinds of bias and experimentation and how research practices help us avoid them. Thanks especially to our subbable subscribers who make this and all of Crash Course possible. If you'd like to contribute to help us keep Crash Course going and also get awesome perks like an autographed science poster or even be animated into an upcoming episode, go to subbable.com/crashcourse to find out how. Our script was written by Kathleen Yale and edited by Blake T. Pastino and myself. Our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins. Our script supervisor is Michael Aranda, who is also our sound designer, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so as the video pointed out, we use the scientific method to address questions about human behavior. So the first step in the scientific method then is to ask a question, think of or observe a behavior that invokes some type of question regarding human behavior, such as, why isn't a person texting me back, might lead you as a psychologist to research what causes people to be attracted to other people, what causes people to reply to other people in communication forums. And then the second thing that you do is form a hypothesis, which is essentially an explanation or answer to your question. It is based on observations. A hypothesis is derived from theory. So we don't just pull hypotheses out of thin air, but instead we look to existing theories to help us answer our research questions, and we formulate our hypotheses that way. It's important that we operationally define our hypotheses, which means we translate the hypothesis into a specific testable procedure that can be measured and observed. So, for example, if we were interested in studying how much college students party, we would have to operationally define the term party. Maybe we would operationally define party as drinking alcohol, in which case we would then have to operationally define what drinking alcohol meant in regards to partying. So is partying drinking 4 mixed drinks in a night? Is partying drinking 20 mixed drinks in a night? Or are we defining partying as the number of social events you go to in a weekend? So operational definitions are very specific and allow us to have a guideline of measurement. The next thing that we would need to do is design an experiment to test our hypothesis. And then after we do our experiment, which we'll look at a bunch of different methods of experimentation and research coming up in this chapter momentarily. But after we have conducted our research, we would have to draw conclusions based on the results of our research. Did we support our hypothesis or not? And then finally, we have to report our results. And generally, the way we report our results in psychology is we write an article which gets published to a scientific journal after being reviewed by other psychologists to make sure that the experiment holds up to the standards of psychology and the scientific method, and that the statistics were done correctly, and that everything is valid and reliable. And if so, then the paper will get published into a scholarly journal, which then people in the public can read. We have a database at the college that you can go on to and read the various articles on psychological research in these scholarly journals. So there are two broad categories of research. You can do, as a psychologist, what's known as descriptive research, which is where you just describe a population as it exists, but there's no manipulation involved whatsoever. And then there is experiments, which does involve manipulation, and we'll talk about that later. So let's look at the different types of descriptive research. There is naturalistic observation, there is participant observation, and we'll talk about some more descriptive research momentarily. But let's start by taking a more in-depth look at naturalistic observation. In naturalistic observation, we are just recording what we see in a natural environment, whether it be observing animals or observing people. Perhaps we want to see how children behave in a daycare center after their parents have dropped them off. And so we would just watch them behave, maybe from behind a two-way mirror so they couldn't see us, and then we would just record what we observe. We're not interacting with the children or manipulating their behavior in any way. We're not giving half of the children sugar and the other half are not getting sugar, and then we're watching them and drawing conclusions about how sugar affects their behavior. We're not doing that. We're just observing them in their environment as they exist naturally and as they behave naturally. And then there is participant observation, which is where we do get involved in the research, and so the population or sample of people that we are observing know that we are there as researchers. This is called overt participant observation. Generally, we will do this if we're interested in studying a culture that we're unfamiliar with. We might ask them if we can join in their day-to-day life, and then we would eat with them and recreate with them and get to observe their different behaviors. There's also what's known as covert participant observation, and generally this is reserved for studying populations that typically don't want to be studied. So maybe cults or prisoners or gang members, and then you would go kind of undercover into the group or the culture, so they wouldn't know that you were there to research them, but you would be acting as though you are one of them, and you would be collecting data. So as you can imagine, this definitely has its pros and cons. The pro to covert participant observation is that you can get some really unbiased data. When people know that they're being watched, they often behave differently. We call this phenomenon the observer effect. And so when you are doing covert participant observation, people don't know that they are being watched for the purpose of research, and so you can get some really great data in terms of it being completely unbiased. However, it's dangerous in that you might be asked to do things that go against your morals, ethics, could go against the law, could be potentially dangerous to your well-being. So it can be something that you need to be very cautious with. One of the things that we have seen that's kind of interesting with covert participant observation is what's known as going native. And going native is when a person that is a researcher is doing covert participant observation but pretending to be a member of the group, and then they actually kind of get sucked into that group and start to identify with that group and will abandon their research and become a legitimate member of the group. One example of this was that there was a psychologist who was studying a group called Pro-Ana, who believes that anorexia should be treated as a lifestyle choice and celebrated and not treated as a disease. And so they have these online forums that the researcher joined, and after about 3 months, she started to embrace the philosophies of Pro-Ana, and she abandoned her research and actually became an actual member of Pro-Ana. Okay, go ahead and pause the video here, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity 2, and then come back and resume at this point in the lecture. And then the next type of descriptive research we're going to talk about is laboratory observation. And so we can research human behavior in a lab setting. Generally, we do this when the natural environment just isn't practical for research, meaning you need special equipment like MRI machines or PET scans or one-way mirrors, computers, EKG machines, etc. This gives the observer a lot of control over the variables, which is nice. We can make the room the temperature we want so that someone being hot or cold doesn't affect their behavior. In other ways, we can kind of control for the variables, any variable we think that might affect behavior. So that's nice because we do have that control and we can see just the pure effects of whatever we think is causing a behavior, causing that behavior. However, it does create an artificial atmosphere, and people tend to act differently when they know that they're being observed, or even just being in a laboratory or kind of that sterile, cold environment. So our findings might not be entirely pure. The next type of descriptive research is archival research, and this is just use of existing data. So as an IO psychologist, one of the things that I will do is go into an organization and they might say to me that their sales are really low. And my method of research would be archival research, in which I would collect all the sales reports, all the behavioral management reports, all of the existing documentation on the employees that I can, and then I would go through it and look for patterns or some type of indication of what might be causing the sales to have decreased over time. The next type of research is the case study, and this is generally when a researcher studies a single individual or a small group of people on many variables. So case studies are done in court cases often. For example, there was recently a case of a woman named Jodi Arias who murdered her ex-boyfriend. She stabbed him, over 20 times, shot him in the face, and then tried to decapitate him. And so, obviously, psychologists would be interested in studying her on many variables, such as her upbringing, her family life, her mental health, her physical health, her hormone levels, her biochemistry, all of that kind of stuff, to see what could have caused this homicidal behavior. And then, of course, the court system, including her defense attorneys and prosecution, would want to know these findings so that they could use it as part of her case. Also, the case study is done when we might come across a mental disorder that hasn't been documented or seen before. For example, there was a man who called up a psychologist and said that he needed therapy because he was having this very real fear that somewhere in the world a duck was staring at him. And this particular phobia was one that hadn't been documented or heard of before, and so a case study was done on this client to see how he came about the development of this disorder and to see if this disorder was in fact valid. And then the person who did this case study gets to name this phobia, and they named it anatidophobia. And so then it goes into the list of phobias that exists. And it turned out in that particular case that there were like 3 or 4 other cases where people had this same exact fear, which kind of validated the existence of anatidophobia. All right, the next type of descriptive research is survey research, and we've all taken surveys before. This is in terms of psychology, when we ask a person their opinion about themselves or their or other people. So we obviously can't survey everyone in a population. Like, let's say that we wanted to know how people in America feel about Justin Bieber. We couldn't ask everybody in America because not everyone has a phone if we wanted to do this via telephone. Or some people are overseas on vacation, or they're soldiers. Or some people might have a medical problem, like they're in a coma. You can't answer a survey about Justin Bieber if you're in a coma. Or you might be a baby, and so you don't speak words yet, so you can't participate in a survey about Justin Bieber. So since we can't ask everybody in a population our research questions, what we have to do is take a sample, which is a smaller group from the population, and that sample has to be representative, which means that they represent the population well, so all facets or aspects of the population are accounted for. For example, if we got a sample of the population of America, but in our sample we only had 50-year-old men, and we asked them how they felt about Justin Bieber, this sample would be unrepresentative and would cause us to get a distorted view on Americans' perspectives of the Bieber. Obviously, there are some drawbacks to the survey method. We can have a bad sample, like the 50-year-old men example I just gave. People lie on surveys. They want to put their best foot forward and make us like them, so they might tell us information that's not entirely true. They might not remember accurately. They become acquiescent, which just is a fancy word for they get bored. And so there's a lot of ways in which we can structure surveys and construct them to try to avoid these problems that are inherent within the survey research method option. We can get rid of obvious desirable answers. We can ask the same questions over and over again so that if people have stopped paying attention and are no longer reading the questions, we could catch that. So there's ways that we try to correct for the cons of survey research, but none of these methods are perfect, and surveys are certainly not a perfect method either. And then the next type of descriptive research is correlational research, and so this is a little bit of statistics. In psychology, like I mentioned, there is a quantitative expectation in our research, which means that there has to be some element of math. And so a correlation is a statistical method that allows us to measure the relationship between two variables. There is a slogan, a motto, a mantra that we say in statistics, which is that correlation does not imply causation. So with correlational research, we're just seeing if there is any relationship between two variables. We're not saying that one variable causes an effect in the other variable. But this is often done in the media, so they will take correlational research and report it as cause and effect relationships, and it really distorts and manipulates ideas in psychological research. So, for example, in the 50s, there was an article published that said, ice cream causes murder. And this was actually based on some research that looked at if there was a correlation between ice cream and murder. And of course, there is a statistically significant relationship between ice cream and murder. But as you know, with correlations, we cannot imply causation, which is exactly what this newspaper article did. The reason that there is a correlation between murder and ice cream is because of hot weather. So when it's hot, we know violent crimes increase, and when it's hot, we know that ice cream sales increase. But to say that because that correlation exists, we can conclude that ice cream causes murder would be ridiculous. And so this is where we need to implore that saying, correlation does not imply causation. All right, and then we have the experiment, and this is no longer an element of descriptive research because in the experiment we are creating some type of manipulation, and so we are going to go through now the different components of an experiment. There's a lot of terminology here that you'll need to know for the exam, so make sure that you take good notes. As you know, one of the steps in the scientific method is to formulate a hypothesis. So let's say that we have a hypothesis that violent TV programs increase aggression. What we would need to do is we would need to manipulate whether or not people got to watch violent TV and then observe their aggression levels as a means of seeing if there is a relationship between violent TV and aggression. And so in the experiment, the manipulation of a variable is done to see if corresponding changes in behavior result. And it is that manipulation of the variable and the control that we have of who gets the manipulation and who doesn't get the manipulation that allows us to determine cause and effect relationships. So let's look now at the variables in the experiment. We have two variables. We have independent variables and dependent variables. the independent variable is the variable we are manipulating, and then there is the dependent variable, and the dependent variable is the variable that we are measuring. So it's called the dependent variable because it depends on what happens with the independent variable. You could think of the independent variable as the cause in the cause and effect relationship, and the dependent variable as the effect in the cause and effect relationship. So if we're looking at this example hypothesis of does violent TV cause aggression, then we would say that that aggression depends on violent TV, and so aggression would be our dependent variable. If we look at light and plant growth, we could say that plant growth depends on how much light it gets, so plant growth is our dependent variable. To that point, we could manipulate the light, right? So we could have two identical plants, and one plant gets light, and one plant doesn't get light. And so light's our independent variable, and we're manipulating that independent variable, and that we're manipulating what plant gets light and what plant doesn't get light. And then we could do this for 2 weeks, let one plant get light and one plant not get light. And then after the 2 weeks, we would go and we would measure how tall the plant was. And the plant growth itself is what we're measuring. And so what we are measuring is called the dependent variable. Okay, head on over to Moodle to complete the next lecture activity. And when you finish the activity, go ahead and come back to this point in the lecture. So in an experiment, we also have groups. We have an experimental group and we have a control group. The experimental group is the group that receives the manipulation, also known as the treatment, and the control group does not receive the treatment or the manipulation. And so the reason we have these two groups is by having the control group, we have a comparison group. So if we were giving violent TV to the experimental group, so they would receive the treatment of watching violent TV, we would have the control group not watch any TV, and then after an hour of the experimental group watching TV and the control group just sitting around reading books or something, we could then ask them to interact with each other. So all the people in the experimental group interact and all the people in the control group interact. And we could see if the people that watched violent TV were more aggressive than the people that did not watch violent TV. And again, it is that control that allows us to determine the cause and effect relationship. So we're comparing the two groups, the group that got the independent variable, the variable we think is causing the behavior, and we're comparing that group against the group that does not get the independent variable and seeing if the reception of this manipulation causes the effect that we've hypothesized it would cause. So we've talked about the idea that we take a representative sample from a population, but then once you have your representative sample, how do you decide who goes in the experimental group and who goes in the control group? Because if you just, as the researcher, walk around and pick people, there might be some bias going on there. So maybe I'm the researcher, and of course I want my hypothesis that violent TV causes aggression. I want that supported. So maybe I unconsciously, unintentionally go around and I pick out people that I think look more aggressive and I put them in the experimental group. And in this way, they'll be more aggressive and my hypothesis will be supported, right? So the way to avoid that is through random assignment. So once I have my representative sample, I can flip a coin, roll dice, pull names out of a hat, and then I am not in charge of what person from my sample goes in what group, who's going in the experimental group and who's going in the control group. Just like with all research, the experiment is not a perfect method of study either, and there are potential hazards that we have to look out for, one of which is called the placebo effect. So the placebo is a false treatment, and the purpose of it is to hide the reason behind why we're doing the study, so that the participants in our study can't figure out what we're doing, and then as people kind of naturally do, if they do figure out the purpose of the experiment, they might try to help out the researcher by acting the way they think the researcher wants them to act. So we might use a placebo to kind of hide the purpose of the study. And the placebo, again, is a false treatment. It might be a sugar pill or an injection of water, and the person thinks they're actually ingesting something that should be changing their behavior, but it shouldn't be. And so sometimes we see what's called the placebo effect, where if I am a drug manufacturer and I want to know if my new cold medicine really reduces symptoms, maybe I give a sample of people, half of them, the experimental group, gets my actual cold medicine, and the other half takes a Skittle with the coating shaved off. And so in reality, what should occur is the people that take my cold medicine, they should get better, and the people that take my Skittle should have no effect. But sometimes people ingest something, and even though it's a fake treatment, they start to feel better. Their cold symptoms recess, they go away, and this is what we call the placebo effect. The phenomenon in which the expectations of the participants in a study can influence their behavior. There's also what's known as the experimenter effect, and the experimenter effect is when the expectations of the experimenter accidentally influence the participants. And so maybe as the experimenter, I go around and I hand out the placebo, and I say to the people getting the placebo, oh, here you go. But then when I go hand out the actual drug, I say something like, oh, you're going to feel a lot better after this. And so the participants kind of pick up on if they're getting the real drug or they're not getting the real drug. One way to try to avoid the experimental hazard of the experimenter effect is to use a single blind procedure. And the single blind procedure is when the participants don't know if they are in the experimental or the control group, because they each receive a pill. One group gets the placebo and one group gets the meds. And then there is the double-blind procedure, and this is when neither the experimenter nor the subject know which group they are in. So maybe you have someone other than the experimenter distribute the meds or the placebo, and then kind of writes down who got what, and after the research is over, at that point the experimenter gets to know who was in what group. So in psychological research, the basic idea is that when you have a representative sample from a population, you want to treat that sample as though all the people in it are as similar as possible. And so maybe you have all the people in the sample come to the lab at the same time. Maybe you have all the people in the sample go to bed at the same time before they experiment and eat the same thing in the morning. And they're all in a room that is the same temperature. And so basically you're treating them as though they are the exact same. The only difference is if they're in the experimental group or the control group and whether or not they received your manipulation. So if you had a group of people that was exactly the same and half of them watched violent TV and then half of them didn't, and the people that watched violent TV were significantly more aggressive, then you could conclude that violent TV causes aggression because these people were exactly the same. The only thing that was different is whether or not they watched violent TV. However, practical logic tells us that, no matter how alike we try to make the participants in our research, they're not the same, and we can't control for all of the variables that might cause someone to be aggressive. And because of that, we can never use the word prove in psychological research. Instead, we have to say that we have found a significant difference between the group that received our independent variable and the group that did not. And even at the conclusion of a study, it would be irresponsible to draw conclusions and generalize them to an entire population after just one study. So we have to replicate research. The more we do research and get the same findings, obviously the more valid that research becomes. And so it's very important that when we do research, we publish it so that other psychologists can replicate our research and make sure that our findings were valid and that they also got the same findings. There haven't always been ethics in psychological research, and later in the semester I'll show you some experiments that did not imply these guidelines for ethical research, but they do exist now, and they are called the APA guidelines for ethical research. APA is the American Psychological Association, or the psychology cops, as I like to refer to them. And so the ethical guidelines include that participants must be protected from physical and mental harm during research. They have the right to privacy regarding their behavior, so their results and participation has to be anonymous. Participation must be voluntary. We can't force someone to be a part of psychological research. And participants must be allowed to make an informed decision about their participation. So they have to sign a document stating that they have been told the basic outline of the study, they're aware that their participation involves any risks, if there are risks, and they must be aware that they can terminate participation at any time. And finally, let's briefly touch on what are known as pseudo-psychologies, which are systems of explaining human behavior that are not based or consistent with scientific evidence whatsoever. So pseudo-psychologies include astrology. Astrological charts were designed over 3,000 years ago, and they're based on stars and planets and constellations, which are no longer in the same place. And so Gemini is really a Cancer, and in 2,000 more years will become a Leo, and so on and so forth. There's what's known as palmistry, or reading someone's palms, and there's overwhelming evidence that there's absolutely no relationship between the lines on our hands and our personality or what will happen in the future. And then there is graphology, which is the analysis of personality through studying handwriting. Respectable companies still use this in hiring. But there is a score close to 0 on accuracy, research shows. Okay, that concludes chapter 1. This is probably the longest chapter of the semester, so don't worry, not all lectures will be this length. But at this point, you can go ahead and head on over to Moodle, or do that on your next check-in, and complete the forum and journal assignments, or self-check assignments. Have a good day.